couldn't be more excited about this. This is, you know, we started to just talk on Planting Westchester probably about a year ago, the beginning of last summer. And we really wanted to kind of model it after the Million Tree campaign, you know, that New York City had done. But we didn't want to call it the Million Tree campaign. And one of my near and dear, you know, kind of projects, I'm the director of energy conservation and sustainability for the county, but I also am the Eastchester Environmental Committee chair here in Eastchester, down here in Westchester. And we had started up a community garden there. And community gardens have always been very important to me. And I see, you know, look at us right now, how food is so important, getting fresh food and you know, just this could happen again. I mean, this is what we're built for, this kind of, you know, food insecurity, you know, and here we are. So I can't thank you guys enough during this really difficult time to get anything done. It's amazing that this got done. And I've been along the ride the whole time here, and I've been looking at all the you know, your drafts and your midterm presentation, and it is fantastic. I'm so glad that it'll be recorded and we can share that out there through you know, our various channels. But I'm going to thank each and every one of you individually later. But man, this is pretty exciting, guys. And it's nice that of our Planting Westchester, which is moving along, we're looking at a bigger picture, creating a website. This will be a part of the website. Millie McGraw here is on the call. She's kind of our lead for the Planting Westchester, the overall component of it. And, you know, I wanted to add the community gardens in, and here we are. You guys did it. So, I mean, now we need to take what you've learned and what you've gleaned for us and, you know, take it to the next level. So I said I'd do it 2 minutes, and I got 2 minutes here. And thank you very much, guys. I'm really excited to hear this and share this with everybody.
All right. And I'd like to just echo a little bit about of what Pete was saying. I mean, this situation has exposed so much about the vulnerabilities across different populations and systems, including our food system. And it gives us kind of a stark reminder about the interconnections between food security and public health and community resilience. And so that these students have taken this opportunity to sort of dig deeper into those connections in Westchester County. And they've been able to provide the county with some roadmaps about how we can navigate and make things more resilient in the future. So I will have the workshop team introduce themselves. These students who really did work tirelessly under very difficult circumstances, including sudden school closures and moving across the country, sickness, all while supporting each other and Westchester County. So if you would like to introduce yourselves, you want to start, Pralaya? Because you're in my corner right here.
Hi, yeah, I'm Pralaya. I am a sustainable development major who's graduating. I have 5 credits this summer that I'm finishing, and then I'm all done. And I worked mostly on the expert interviews and literature review and research on the benefits of gardens for this project. And I'm happy to be here today.
Sonia?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Sonia. I served as the project manager for our small capstone team. So mostly doing logistical work as well as contributing to a little bit of research and other aspects of this project. I'm a current junior, or rising senior rather, in Columbia College, and I'll be graduating in December after finishing up the fall semester.
Fiona?
Hi everyone, my name is Fiona and I'm a senior studying economics and sustainable development. For this project, I worked on helping to create the fact sheets, doing some of the financing research, and then also some of the expert interviews and benefits for the community garden. So really excited to be here. Thank you so much for coming.
Libby?
Hi everybody, my name is Libby. I'm a Sustainable Development and Latin American and Iberian Cultures senior. So today's my final endeavor of undergraduate, and I helped do some really interesting community outreach and geospatial analysis for the project.
And Nianguo.
Hi, I'm Nianguo, and I'm also a sustainable development major, graduating at the end of the semester. And I primarily worked on the geospatial analysis part of the project. Thank you for having me.
And I just want to recognize as well Dr. Rosenthal, who was the professor on this project, and I'll give you a few minutes to say anything you want, as well as David Juros, who is present underneath me on my screen. And David sort of really served as some inspiration, as well as several community gardeners that have been doing this work in Westchester for many, many years. And David also served as an advisor to these students in many respects. So I really want to thank you for your guidance as well and your time. Joyce, did you want to say something?
Yeah, hi, just unmuting myself. Can you see me?
Yeah.
I'm Joyce Klein-Rosenthal, and I'm a research scholar at the Center for Sustainable Urban Development, the Earth Institute at Columbia University, and also an assistant professor in which I get to teach this workshop for sustainable development course, which is a capstone course. It's been such a pleasure working with students like these, and I want to give a special shout out to the team who's graduating and graduating next year. Sonia, you're 2021, class of 2021?
Yes, but I think my official graduation date is in winter of 2020.
Ah, great. Okay, you're 2020. Everyone's 2020. Nianguo, Libby, Pralaya, Fiona, congratulations. I think for all of you, this might be the capstone assignment as well as the capstone course. And you've done an exceptional job. It's been a pleasure. You've had a terrific client. I want to really thank Anjali and Peter for all their input, expert thought, advisement. Anjali and I had worked on a fall 2019 workshop together, and it's fantastic that you were able to conceptualize and begin this Planting Westchester initiative. I gather that food gardens are becoming more important as we know that food scarcity is on the rise in the United States. And Westchester County, I live very close by in the Northwest Bronx, is not immune from the problems of food scarcity and hunger in the rest of the area. And the students have done, as Anjali said earlier, such an amazing job in thinking through county community relationships, the potential role of food gardens, and to try to provide a great basis for advisement on the project. So thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Peter and Anjali, and to the students.
So would you like to start your presentation now?
Yes, I have some slides that I'm going to share. So just give me a second to set that up. Great. Can you all see?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you so much again for coming to our presentation. We have titled our project Planting Seeds for Planting Westchester, Opportunities for Westchester County Support of Community Gardens. So here's a quote from one of the wonderful community leaders who we had the pleasure of interviewing for this project, identified by their initials, EB. We are trying to take advantage of this period to get people to get in a connection to their food and celebrate that whole thing of just starting something for themselves. So to briefly go over today's schedule, we're going to start by talking briefly about our research and interviews, go into our geospatial analysis, talk about the Planting Westchester guide that we had the pleasure of editing, talk about the fact sheets and resources that we have created for the future Planting Westchester website. And we ask that everybody hold all their questions till the end. We are planning to have a community-wide discussion and would love to hear your input on our presentation and the work that we've done. So just briefly, the project goals. So the overarching goal was to green Westchester County and increase food access through community gardens. And as part of our research, we wanted to conduct a literature review and interview community groups to better understand the situation in the county, as well as the academic background and the need for community gardens and the role that they might play. We wanted to create geospatial map resources to map out areas where community gardens already exist, where they might exist in the future, and to essentially provide a space for the community to crowdsource existing resources. We wanted to edit and offer recommendations on the Planting Westchester guide that was written and first drafted by David Juros and his son, who created the Pleasantville Community Garden up in Pleasantville. And this is sort of a how-to guide on creating a food donation garden, which we'll speak more about a little later. And finally, we wanted to create fact sheets for the Planting Westchester website and basically consolidate resources and resource lists that already exist in the community. So I will just go over briefly our approach. So the first part was listening. We wanted to really ensure that community voices were heard. And so we tried to focus both our academic and community level research on voices within the county and on county specific items. Our second part of our approach was mapping. So mapping potential suitable areas in existing land parcels. And the goal of this was really to create resources to enable further action by both community members and the county. And the third part was what we called enabling doing. So creating guides and a resource hub, and then offering some recommendations to the county on next steps. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Pralaya to talk about our research.
Yes, thank you, Sonia. So as Sonia mentioned, our research consisted of an extensive literature review and a series of expert interviews. And although there are numerous benefits to community gardens, we found there to be 5 primary benefits. If you could go to the next slide, please, Sonia. But before discussing these benefits in a bit more detail, it's important to note that all of these benefits are contingent on how they are purposefully designed and the focus of good management. So it's really what you want to focus on in terms of the design of your garden. So the first benefit is that gardens can foster greater climate health, ecological restoration, and community climate change resilience. For example, they can help mitigate storm and flood impacts when impervious surfaces are replaced with soil because they improve water regulation through the absorption of water runoff. They reduce air and water pollution by increasing plants to sequester carbon. Incorporating composting methods is another one, and as well as and growing food locally, which increases local food availability and ensures greater food security during crises especially. Incorporating particular plants, trees, or shrubs can improve and restore local ecology and biodiversity, and they can reduce the urban heat island effect, which cools the surrounding area for visitors, and they also improve environmental awareness and behavior through programs, educational programs within garden management and teaching. In terms of economic benefits, the property value surrounding the community gardens has been found to increase in response to the implementation of community gardens, which has been found to increase city tax revenue. And they also facilitate employment, education, and entrepreneurship opportunities through the provision of job training and skill building, especially amongst the local schools and student populations in the surrounding area. Gardens can foster restorative mental health benefits, and they can function as healing therapeutic spaces that improve mood and behavior by allowing people to connect with nature, increase social connections. They can aid and prevent and disrupt and restore mental disorders like stress, anxiety, depression, and attentional functioning. They're found to heal past traumas, especially in those with frequent direct contact with soil, which is found to contain little microbes that can boost serotonin and reduce these issues. Community wellness is enhanced by gardens because they empower and provide the local population with safe, accessible green space that has been linked to neighborhood improvements such as reduction in violence and property crimes, and increases in multi-generational connections and social capital, and these empower the community. Wellness also fosters community resilience, which overlaps with climate justice, but from this perspective, it is articulated to do so by encouraging information sharing and greater communication between groups, which reduces social isolation and increases neighbor-to-neighbor assistance, where neighbors help one another after or during crises, like what we're seeing with COVID-19. These impacts can be reduced. Gardens can also improve physical health and fitness by increasing exercise and keeping people moving during participation activities, by reducing risky sexual behavior, decreasing health conditions like obesity, asthma, and premature death. They also provide local populations with affordable, quality, healthy, nutrient-dense fruits, vegetables, and herbs, and by educating people about healthier lifestyles and eating habits, which are found to alleviate local food insecurity. So we can go to slide 8, please. So these are our lovely experts and their approximate locations throughout the county. I want to note that after hearing from our first few experts, we became aware of some concerns in terms of climate change and crisis like COVID-19 concerns, especially in how they impact community, food access, and gardens, which informed the rest of our interviews in terms of the questions we asked to gain more knowledge about these concerns. So if we can go to slide 9, please. So after our interviews were completed, we created these 5 key codes from the topics, concerns, and ideas that were expressed by multiple experts, which, if we can go to the next slide, these can be addressed in a sort of temporal or hierarchical way to foster a greater establishment of resilient community gardens within the county in the future. I think the overarching one, although if I had time, I would have redesigned this, but the overarching, I think, goal that we should kind of tackle first is the central clearinghouse. This overarching idea is expressed by most experts. It was the high value and need for a central clearinghouse, and many of them suggested that the county could be very helpful by establishing an overarching one that can address or facilitate stronger action on these other 4 key issues or topics that we see here. This clearinghouse should engage in active learning and listening from the pre-existing networks, and should facilitate and listen to local community visions. There's also demand for fiscal support, the development of a sharing service for infrastructure and tools, and in mapping out where the current resources are located. Due to the difficulty in acquiring these needs, it is suggested that the county resources can go a long way in aiding them in the future. Land scarcity is a prominent issue, and there are 3 key ingredients that are needed for the greater establishment of new and viable community gardens: security of land, protection of land, and approval of land. Many experts mentioned that access can and has been secured by linking farmers to landowners, and that adaptive design can be used to expand urban garden potential. Some experts also mentioned that there is an issue of differential availability between South and North Westchester that should be addressed as well. There is still an identified need to secure local food access, and gardens function as resilience builders and can act as local food assets that promote food sovereignty. Growing food, knowing why and how to do it organically is empowering. Current shortage of fresh food options for food bank recipients is important and was noted. Access strengthened, and moving from receiving donations to growing for oneself is considered key. And mitigating climate change vulnerability. In terms of outreach, it must be expanded to include broader socioeconomic groups, because there are disparities and challenges to participation opportunities in community gardens and programs that span across the socioeconomic spectrum. And participation can be increased and facilitated through veteran gardeners, appointed champions that local communities respect, and most importantly, always keeping local communities in the driver's seat. Hold on one second. So gardens should also be kept as local as possible, and simplicity matters. These are low, they should be considered low barriers to entry. And it's crucial for local individuals to take the initiative to obtain knowledge, especially concerning these issues. Strength of organization and support should and must come from different stakeholder levels, and successful gardens need one or a few managers, supervisors, and leaders, and they also need champions at the community and municipal levels of government who can advocate for them. A strong volunteer base is critical. The identified groups that can be counted on most are seniors and students, and any individuals with available service hours that need to be filled. Active gardeners pointed out that it is unsustainable to land one or two people with all of the upkeep tasks. Also, community gardens are valued for more than garden skills and often can be innate educators. So it's really important to have a good volunteer base. And we can move to slide 11 now, please, Sonia. So these are our key learnings, which are somewhat of a recap of the key codes, but garden success and durability are achieved by seeking long-lasting leaders and volunteers during initial plans and proposals, cultivating partnerships, for example, with stewardship organizations, and actively pursuing monetary support and land. Community participation can be galvanized by appointing individuals who will be admired by fellow community members. Food security issues can be improved by increasing opportunity for new experiences and dialogue at the level of the soil, especially between and within communities who are facing the disparate social determinants of health that have been identified. Westchester County can be most helpful by acting as a central clearinghouse for community gardens and providing funding and support in the future, and transparently engaging community hub leaders. And if we can move to our final slide in research. Upon conclusion of our extensive literature review and our expert interviews, we came up with a list of future recommendations that you see here that can be taken on by the community and the county together. The key kind of takeaways or next steps would be to plan for future weather patterns and build gardens to be resilient against associated impacts, engage with greater number of experts, especially across the socioeconomic spectrum, create and oversee a clearinghouse by compiling all of the necessary information that individual potential gardeners can acquire, to build small hub-like gardens in order to kind of facilitate greater connection and access in communities that are currently not being addressed right now, and to maintain clear channels of communication with experts and local communities is also key in order to keep them in the driver's seat and kind of keep the dialogue going constantly. Encouraging and to encourage and include participation of full socioeconomic spectrum, especially during the decision-making processes, is going to be really important, and to create a tool for stakeholders to inquire on availability and accessibility of land, and perhaps report parcels that they come across themselves, which may help facilitate the implementation of a greater number of gardens in the future. So this is the conclusion of our research section of this presentation, and I'd like to now hand it over to our wonderful Libby. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pralaya. Very happy to continue the conversation. In pursuit of one big goal that Pralaya mentioned, we thought that a way for the county to sort of come to embody this role of a clearinghouse that would connect resources across the county was to do some initial geospatial analysis, which is a jargony term for using geographic information systems to basically just get a lay of the land in terms of thinking about both what exists and what may come to be in the future based on a concept of what's optimal or suitable for placing a community garden. Sonia, we can move to the next. So the slide is titled Ideal Workflow because we initially received from the county a shapefile, which is a geographic data format of 36 county-owned residual properties. So very tiny little slices of land that we were tasked with determining the suitability for in developing gardens. So we started with a literature review. We thought we would be spending a lot of hours behind the software. Not to say that Nianguo didn't spend many hours doing complex data transformations at his desktop, but what we really came to understand was that this community outreach and the knowledge of doing and growing on the ground was what would help imbue a concept of suitability with substance and with relevance for the local Westchester context. So we have two map products that we're going to show, are two map deliverables that are really in progress. But what we hope is that we can use a crowdsourced map of existing gardens to inform what attributes actually define suitability in Westchester. And we hope they can come to make up a database upon which an analyst can do analysis for patterns that would help inform what suitability really means here, because it's highly variable across any locality. Thank you, Sonia. So this is a sort of summary of the workflow in a different way with a few screenshots of the products that are currently still in progress. But the first objective is to crowdsource the community. So that would be where the community shares information about their garden sites that they know best. And the county, working at this macroscopic level, is able to support them fiscally and connect their resources. The second objective is to, well, we thought it was to start by finding a place and people to suit a garden. But what we ended up hearing from community leaders was that there is no one definition of what's suitable for a community garden. It's not a uniform good. And so you really can be creative and improvise and shape a garden to suit the place and people that are right around the site, which is exciting. And we're seeing a lot of that innovation in these pandemic times. And ultimately, the two maps should help to energize and engage the community around laying out this land of the food shed. And this is an important aspect of establishing or securing and documenting food sovereignty. As the Stepping Stones Museum for Children in Norwalk, Connecticut is already helping children engage to do. And there are very, very cool other initiatives that involve qualitative mapping and hand drawing and engaging interactively with community stakeholders to, make sure that the map is the territory according to the people that reside there. Awesome. Thank you, Sonia.
So I'm going to lay out the framework of our geospatial analysis so that the following slides flow in a way that best represents the processes and the thought process that went into creating the two maps. So before we started each map, we first had to conceptualize the use of the map and frame the question. So essentially, what is the necessity of creating these maps, and eventually what do we want the map to tell us? We then moved on to exploring different data sets for the site suitability map and sorted the data through extensive literature review and by performing expert interviews. For the crowdsourced map, we set up a platform using 123 survey that would allow us to collect the data from the public and filled in the platform with points of existing community gardens. The final step was to perform the analysis and create the maps so that they can be used for further analysis. We're going to move on to describing both of these maps, and we'll start off with Libby and the crowdsourced map.
Awesome. So the question that we wanted to know from local community growers and organizers was actually several, which we compiled into a pretty comprehensive Survey 123 platform. Some of them, in a broad sense, were these. Where are Westchester's gardens? Who's organizing them and working on them? What do they grow and where does it go? I placed myself in a bit of a Texas, so I hope the noise is not too distracting. But I'm benefiting from the fresh air. So, anyways, we wanted to know how are existing gardens similar and different, and then ultimately to inform this process of defining suitability for Westchester. So this is an awesome photo that we received from a community submission, Linda Tarrant-Reed, who organizes the Grow Lincoln Park and Ward Acres Community Gardens in New Rochelle. So clearly there's a very youthful energy to Westchester's garden landscape, and we want to advertise that and share it. Thanks, Sonia. So this is a screenshot on top of the header to the Survey 123 questionnaire, which can be accessed from the browser, and the link will be provided later in the presentation. But we basically organized the questions based on community expert suggestions, as well as consulting New York City Parks Green Thumb's pretty famous community services map called the Oasis map. They had conducted a survey of their community gardens that was very comprehensive. And then what the Survey 123 platform links to is a series of what are called feature services and basically associated maps that can be accessed through a web browser as well in ArcGIS Online. Thanks, Sonia. So these are a few examples of the questions that were included in the survey. A very key question is the GeoPoint field, which allows the user to type in the address of their garden site and plot it, and this is what gets fed through to the ArcGIS Online map. But we also wanted to know what the garden's mission statement was, if one exists, and allowed for a multiple choice question about how organizers conceive the model of their garden. And we recognize that a lot of organizers think of their gardens as performing many benefits and being many models. So we allowed for that flexibility, and we want to respect that there is no binary for how a community garden is defined. So this is a bit of what has resulted from the process. This is the link to the questionnaire, as well as the QR code if you happen to have your camera ready and want to scan and visit it. And then you can also access the web map. I have two screenshots from our listing of services on ArcGIS Online. The left side is actually what is the web map that faces the county GIS organization. So that's why several of the points are red, because I submitted them myself as sort of placeholders for gardens that we do know exist, but that we just haven't heard from directly through their organizers, whereas the 3 green stars were direct community submissions after we sent out an initial email to the community experts that we had interviewed, asking that they sort of beta test the survey and provide us with some feedback on whether the questions we were asking were relevant, what they thought we could improve upon. We know that we need to ground this interactive crowdsource in buy-in from the community in order for them to want to use it and to share it in a meaningful way, and for it to be useful for the county as well.
Thank you, Libby. So as introduced, we're going to move on to the site suitability map. And we decided to perform a weighted overlay analysis to create a connection with the crowdsource map, as a weighted overlay analysis would help us determine the relative significance of different factors that make up what community garden development is suitable. So the next step for us was to frame the question of the map. So what factors are important, the criteria? What data is available to us? And how do we want to visualize the analysis so that it falls under a suitable context? And finally, how can we apply it to the residual parcels currently available and the future parcels that we will identify? So to determine the criteria for our analysis, we studied different case studies performed in Madison, Portland, and Chicago, as well as learned from our interviews with Westchester local gardening community experts. So we decided to use three main categories: neighborhood characteristics, accessibility, and biophysical features. And within each category, we used different factors to make up the category, which will be listed on the next slide. We decided to weigh the different factors equally, so they're equally as important, as we learned that the significance varies at different sites. And so we only chose to weigh the different main categories, which are on the slide. To make the map easy to understand, we normalized the data from a scale from 0 to 1, least suitable to most suitable. Thank you, Sonia. So this slide shows the three individual maps that were created for the final weighted overlay analysis. From left to right, we have accessibility, which includes disability status, percentage of the population without a vehicle, and proximity to bus stops. Then we have neighborhood characteristics, which include per capita income, structures with 10+ housing units, percentage of the population aged 65 and plus, and the college student age. And the final map shows the biophysical features using slope and floodplain. So this map shows the final unweighted overlay analysis, which shows that suitability does vary across the state, but in general terms are considered suitable in most areas, apart from the lighter regions. But it is important to realize that this map doesn't display the need for community gardens. So the regions that show less suitability should not be excluded, if possible, when considering the construction of community gardens. Instead, it could be used as a way of realizing what factors need to be improved to make these areas more suitable for community garden development. So the primary purpose of this map, as we mentioned before, is to narrow the scope to help the county in their decision for community garden development. So once the county has identified the regions that they want to work with, however, it requires further analysis. So we have come up with a recommendation as to how to proceed with their analysis. And Libby will talk a little about it in the next slide.
Thank you, Nianguo. Excellent work. I love those colors. But, you know, as he mentioned, a model is definitely a simplification of reality, and we do recognize that there are many successful community gardens up in northern Westchester where those areas were lighter, and you know, our indicators and our categories only express a suggestion of suitability that at this point isn't particularly calibrated to Westchester in all its variability, but one way to sort of differentiate what suitability means is to rely on the residual properties and further investigation, and think about our three categories of indicators as interacting in the way that's shown in this diagram. You know, you sort of can understand your neighborhood profile at a half-mile radius, and think about whether the neighborhood needs a garden, whether the neighborhood supports a garden, whether those two mean the same thing or something different, and how they contribute to demand for a garden, and thus knowing whether the garden might be able to survive. But also looking at site specifics in terms of biophysical features. We didn't include too many biophysical traits at the county-wide level because looking more specifically at the parcel scale, really getting boots on the ground to understand the limitations can also illuminate ways to adapt to those challenges. And access is a multi-scalar concept where you're looking at sidewalks, you're looking at driveways, you're looking at bike and pedestrian corridors right around the site, but you're also thinking about networks of public transportation and roads for people using their personal vehicles to access the site. So on the left are a few sort of key suggestions for consideration of what makes up suitability in Westchester from our experts that we spoke to, and relying on community input to sort of guide the criteria selection means that you avoid this fallacy of thinking that if we just put a garden site here, people will come to it and people will support it. Community gardens are community-led. It's been argued that, you know, community is the more important word of the two in the phrase. Thanks, Sonia. So a few specific ways to go parcel by parcel are to use some aerial imagery to look at tree canopy, other obstructions around the site, some of those more site-specific access traits, and then to perhaps hire a summer intern to be a ground truther and go visit that site and engage with residents right around the site, maybe put up a banner and just ask people to come to a community meeting and have them draw out their ideas for what the site could become, because it won't last unless it feels owned and conceived of by those that we hope to have participate in it. Thanks, Sonia. So this is just one example of some further detail we added on looking at a residual property, which is again a tiny slice of land that the county owns. They own 36 of them across the map, across the territory. So the green parcel at the bottom right corner of the map is titled the PMR Resid B. Because it's in Pelham Manor, down in the southern part of the county. So what we did was applied a 1/4 mile buffer and a 1/2 mile buffer. The first essentially represents like walkability. So anything inside of that perimeter, you know, we think that pedestrians could get to. And a 1/2 mile is a good approximation of a neighborhood scale. We see that some bus stops are just outside of that neighborhood outline. So what we did was applied some community facilities data layers from the county GIS site to the map. So they included bus stops, senior centers, and youth bureaus, because we had understood that demographically younger and older folks are often very willing to be engaged by gardening. We looked at some aerial photos, so we can see there's very little tree canopy and pretty good accessibility in terms of driveways, residences, sidewalks, streets. And then we also consulted the Census Bureau's very helpful narrative profile reports at the tract level, just to sort of get a very baseline socioeconomic and demographic look at this quote unquote neighborhood around the parcels. But we also did a detailed look at 2 more of the residual properties and found, for example, that their median household incomes were a bit lower and their poverty levels were closer to 10%, with a bit higher percentages of people receiving SNAP benefits, but also indicate the need for residents and the desire for residents to have a collective open green space, and therefore suggest viability or suitability for a garden. Thank you, Sonia.
Okay, so
Sorry, Nianguo.
the parcel analysis that Libby just explained is only a small example of what can be done using the site suitability map and the resources that are already available on the county website. The map shown here is an example of the web map that we created with some of the variables that we included. Of course, more variables can be included, such as food pantries and schools and churches, to make the analysis more complete. And the analysis can be completed without the use of a web map. So, furthermore, visualizing the location of the parcels are very important. As we know, potential gardens need to have support from municipal garden champions so that the county could prioritize securing support in the towns where there are a relative greater number of parcels. If we hit the next button, the pie chart displays the location of the existing 36, this pie chart, sorry, location of the existing 36 county-owned parcels. So we are now going to move on to the Pleasantville guide, where our project manager, Sonia, will talk about. You're muted.
Thank you. Thank you, Nianguo. So just to provide some brief background on this, this was a guide that was originally titled the Pleasantville Guide, and that was written by David Juros, who's on this call today, and his son, about their experience creating a food donation garden in Pleasantville in Westchester. And so our role was to look at the guide, provide recommendations, edits, and suggestions. And so to do that, we went through this process where we first wanted to draft a benefits section at the request of David Juros, which would describe the benefits of community gardens. And so you've already seen earlier in the presentation, Pralaya talked about the various benefits that a community garden provides to those who live around it. And so we effectively transformed that into written text that was easily consumable by readers, and added that into the guide. We also did edits to the guide, so we read through it, provided some line-by-line edits, and some high-level recommendations. And I do want to note that this guide is not really aimed towards experts who already exist in the community, as obviously you all have extensive knowledge of the process of creating a community garden, but rather it's aimed towards those who are creating a garden for the first time and may not know the details of how to set up the organization, the structure, or the other processes that one has to go through to create the garden rather. So the first recommendation that we gave to the county was to shorten the guide and make it really concise and accessible to a lot of individuals. The second recommendation was to acknowledge other organizations. So our interviews showed that organizations in Westchester County want their work to be recognized by the county more than it already is. And so to facilitate that, as part of the GIS analysis, we sent out kind of a snowball survey of community groups in the hopes of creating a crowdsourced database of all of the groups that exist in the county that are already working on these issues to better connect and facilitate connections throughout the community. The third recommendation that we gave was to include county support information. So this guide is unique from other guides that exist because it is produced by the county and can therefore provide information about resources specific to the county. So we recommend that they include some additional personalized information that may help ease the concerns of the community that this might just be another kind of generic how-to guide. So we want to make this really specific and specialized for Westchester County. The fourth recommendation that we had was to include a disclaimer regarding the audience. So This guide in particular is geared towards food donation gardens, as I stated before. And in our research, we found sort of 3 major categories of gardens. And of course, there are more that do not fall into these categories. And those were donation gardens, subsistence gardens, which are created just for individuals to provide food to themselves, their families, or their community. And then teaching gardens, which are created for a primarily educational purpose. So we recommend creating more guides for these other kinds of gardens, or incorporating other gardens into the current guide, and again keeping the same lens of providing unique information about the county and county resources. Finally, we just wanted to format the guide to be a little bit more interactive, so adding more pictures and color. And so we also really wanted this to be formatted without hyperlinks for print use, so that people can, print this guide out and take it with them while they're going about creating their community gardens. And so with that, I'm going to pass this over to Fiona to talk about fact sheets and additionally some community financing.
Thanks so much, Sonia. Next slide, please. So our initial conception of the fact sheet deliverable was really to create fact sheets that detailed how to create a community garden that were really easily accessible to anyone interested in that process. As soon as we started doing research and reaching out to community experts, we realized that there was already a lot of really, really important information out there. There were already a lot of fact sheet resources that existed. And so we switched our conception of the fact sheet deliverable to be focused on creating some of our own resource lists that help compile different fact sheets from around the county, and resources that already existed, and then also trying to compile resources from organizations already doing community gardening and community food access work, to try to embody this vision of the county as a central clearinghouse with lots of resources that anyone who is interested in creating community gardens can access. And we decided to do this because we didn't want to reinvent the wheel. We wanted to honor the work of the organizations that have already been working so hard on this for so many years. And we also wanted to really respect the experts that have been creating information on this versus trying to come up with information from our own less expert experience. So with this in mind, next slide, please, Sonia. We created a variety of resource list style fact sheets. And so this includes resources for raised bed soil testing and soil health, planting and harvesting intervals and good crops for the county, necessary permissions for land use, which Sonia was really instrumental in creating, which is a fact sheet that guides people through the processes of permitting in 3 different municipalities, resources on pollination and supporting pollinators, and resources on container gardening, and a container gardening bingo for kids that Libby was really instrumental in creating. So in addition to this, we started the process of reaching out to community organizations to see if it would be possible to use some of their fact sheets and materials that they have already created in terms of making that information available to the county so that people who are interested in creating community gardens can access those resources too. Next slide, please. Thanks, Sonia. And you can just click to the end. Thanks so much. So this just kind of shows the process, the progress, and the opportunity. We gathered initial research to create these resource lists, drafted the fact sheets, and began the process of outreach to community organizations, completed our own resource lists, and then really the big opportunity here to highlight is that this is a process, and there's a lot more to be done in actually creating a central clearinghouse that includes resources from all sorts of community organizations and really is a connection from the county to community organizations to people interested in beginning this gardening process and food access process. And we do want to especially thank Amy Album at the Cornell Cooperative Extension in Westchester County for sharing some of her resources with us. And those were really helpful in beginning to create this clearinghouse. Next slide, please. So this is an example of one of our completed resource lists. And thank you so much. So resources for planting cycles and native plants. And it links to a couple resources to help people have information on this topic in one place. Next slide, please. So based on ideas that have been mentioned consistently throughout this presentation, we envisioned this central clearinghouse as being a hub to connect growers across the spectrum of experience to land, information, and experience, and also potentially to provide funding opportunities to support community gardening efforts. And with this in mind, we did a little bit of preliminary research on financing options, with the goal being, we heard from so many experts that it's really challenging to find funding for community gardens. And so we saw a huge opportunity if the county is interested in trying to obtain funding that could be provided at the county level to anyone interested in strengthening or creating community gardens. Next slide, please. Thanks, Sonia. And you can just click all the way to the, thanks so much. So we did a little bit of preliminary research. If the county is interested, one idea is the Climate Smart Communities Grant Program is a New York state level grant program that provides grants for climate adaptation efforts. And we think there's a really strong case to be made that community gardens are part of climate adaptation and resiliency. So that's one option. The other option is there were a variety of foundations that offer grants to communities working on climate mitigation adaptation efforts. And then finally, there's opportunities for public-public and public-private partnerships that could help to create some type of county community gardening fund, and really create this central clearinghouse of resources and funding and information, and connect experts and anyone at any spectrum of gardening experience with the support of the county. Thanks, Sonia. Next slide. So moving forward, one thing that we just wanted to highlight, especially in the funding aspect of this project, is that COVID-19 has made a lot of things really apparent, and two of them are food chain resilience and local food, the need for strong food chains and the need for local, easily accessible food. And then, sorry, the other bubble is supposed to say community resilience, so the need for community resilience and connection. And we know, as Pralaya mentioned earlier, that community gardens are part of our solutions and part of doing both of those things, both food chain resilience, community connection, and local food. So in the midst of a very bad situation, we hope that there's options for funding that in the rebuilding efforts, community gardens can really be part of that rebuilding and part of the resilience that we hope to create. Okay, so now I'll turn it over to Sonia for the key findings.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And just to add a little bit to the point on COVID-19, we do hope that, we're seeing this resurgence of interest in community gardens, and we really hope that and that recognition that these gardens can really be a form of resilience will continue into the future, and that people will recognize the value of these gardens for their environmental, community, and economic impacts far into the future and well after this crisis is over. So with that, I want to present some key findings that we really want to highlight at the end of our presentation. So the first is that government-community linkages need to exist in order for effective programs to exist. And so we really hope that the second point, government functioning as a central clearinghouse, distilling information and creating resources, will kind of help inform the first point. So we really hope that our work collecting all this information will be a first step in creating that clearinghouse and creating a resource hub for the community. Finally, community gardens are part of, but not the entire solution when it comes to food access. So, we really do want to highlight that creating a community garden can be very expensive. For example, the Pleasantville garden that was featured in our manual had initial overhead costs of about $10,000, and that's not always accessible, especially because it's sometimes very hard to obtain funding. And so we do want to highlight the need for other solutions, that community gardens, while they have many benefits, are not kind of the be-all end-all of this. And just before we move on to our discussion, I want to thank all of the experts in the community that loaned us their time and their expertise for this project. I want to thank our advisors at the county, Anjali, Peter, and David, for being so wonderful throughout this entire process. I want to thank our advisor, Dr. Joyce Klein-Rosenthal, and our wonderful TA, Maria Claudia, for advising us throughout this entire process and supporting us through these very unprecedented times. And of course, I want to thank the team that I had the wonderful privilege of working with throughout this semester. And finally, I want to thank all of you for attending this presentation. So that's a lot of thank yous. And so now we're just going to move on to the discussion part. We really want to hear your feedback on our research. What can be done better, what did you like, and so just to facilitate this discussion, because I think we have about 30 people on the call right now, please raise your hand through the feature in Zoom, and somebody will call on you and we'll start the discussion off that way, and then perhaps can move to a more organic form of discussion as this unfolds. So thank you so much, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. Great. Yeah, I see Nada is raising her hand. So Nada, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you all so much. I think you did a fabulous job. I congratulate all of you. I'm really pleased that 3 of you had a chance to come to the ResProp office. I really was intrigued to learn about the 36 residual plots that belong to the county. And I noticed there were 2 in White Plains and 2 in Greenberg, 4 in White Plains. So I'm just wondering, like, for members of the community, what would be the process? And perhaps this is a question for the county government, but what's the process for us to explore the possibility of using this county-owned property for gardens? A few of you on this call know that I've been trying for the past couple of years to turn the plot in front of the Westpac office on Route 119 in Greenberg into a pollinator pathway. The New York State Thruway Authority is taking a very long time to decide, and it belongs to the state. So in this case, if the Westchester County government is interested and is willing to use their property for pollinator pathways, for gardens, what would be the process? What's the next step for us to pursue this?
Well, we have a couple of we actually have the commissioner planning. Norm, would you like to speak up on this, or is Dave Kavinga, did he make it to the presentation?
Dave isn't here, but I would like to recognize Westchester County Planning Commissioner Norma Drummond, as well as the county legislator, Nancy Barr, and thank you both for joining us. And I'm wondering if either of you could chime in to help answer that question.
Sure, this is Norma Drummond. Thank you. First off, let me start by saying thank you very much. I got on a couple minutes late, but I was here right for the start of the presentation. So excellent work. The the parcels that the county has available, there's a whole range of reasons as to why these parcels are available, and then the sizes of them and everything else. First off, we'd have to get buy-in from the county that we in fact think that this is, certainly a way to go. And, this is a great start to be able to show that need. But there's always issues like insurance and other things as well that would all have to get worked out. So we're really going to have to work through our own. There is a director of real estate at the county, so we'll have to work through with the county leadership just to see how can we facilitate making the process of making some of these lots as easily accessible as possible. The one question I wanted to ask was, is there an optimum size? Is there an optimum number of households that participate? Or is there an optimum number, amount of land that really needs to get looked at? What creates a good community garden and what doesn't?
Good question. And I'll follow up on the residual property question after we discuss this part. So that's a good question, Norma. Thank you.
If I could just speak quickly to that question, I mean, that sort of is the fundamental inquiry of defining suitability for Westchester. I think one of the key takeaways we found in speaking to community experts, though, was that the definition of suitability can be flexible. You can really work with a small parcel of land or a very skinny, narrow inlet, because you could line up 10 sock gardens and call that a community garden. Or you could get together a collection of grow bags and put them on a parcel, that you've got approval to use. So it really does, I think, depend on getting out there to each of these sites on the ground and going door to door with a survey, or putting up a banner and saying, what would you like to see here? Maybe that links to a survey or an invitation to a community workshop. I mean, I know this requires county capacity and resources, but there are, I'm sure, tons of college students who would be interested in, flexing their young muscles in that way. To sort of like really customize it to each site and each neighborhood.
Yeah, I would say just to make sure that it's sustainable, that it continues, that's one of the issues with community gardens, that they're built and they're great and they last for a year or two and then they go fallow, is to have a real desire for them, maybe an overabundance of people that want that community garden. And that's what we have in Eastchester. We have a list of people that want to get in there. We got to, we want a bigger garden, that sort of thing that helps sustain it, because people drop off, and if you don't fill them up with other people, then your garden, goes fallow. Like I said, I do want to get back to Nada's original question. It was kind of my idea. I knew about I worked with Gary Friedman, who is our director of real estate, and I had heard about those residual properties. And it was kind of my idea, like, well, let's take a look at these residual properties. And I threw it out there to Libby and the gang. And, just finding where they are and locating them was a task in itself. There's two things I would like to mention. With a lot of this, the county has a very good neighbor policy. Like, we couldn't just go in there and seize that property and start planning. Of course, obviously. We would do it, obviously, in conjunction with the residents around there, with the town and municipality itself. There's a lot of that going on. And I will say that the properties, as was mentioned by Norma, they're residual properties for a reason. They're just not suitable for much of anything, and we just own them. And we carry them, but that's saying, this is the original idea, to look at those residual properties. So we would like to continue doing that. So.
If I can just add one more thing on to about,
Yes,
in county government, there are 3 owners of land, okay? Only county parks, county environmental facilities, or our public works departments are allowed to own land. So if it's a park piece, again, it's a different, board that actually has to look at it to determine whether it's in fact they don't like the word residual on that board. So whether it's in fact surplus, I guess,
Yeah.
if it's environmental facilities, we always have to be careful. It's generally then there's a trunk line, there's some kind of sewer connection somewhere there. So we'd have to be careful about that. And then generally Public Works is the be all end all owner of county land. So again, we'd have to worry about, you know, anything, you know, how close they are to, you know, to any kind of site distance issues or any kind of traffic issues, things, because we don't want to create conditions that might become unsafe then in any neighborhood.
Future use and whatnot. Yeah.
I think there's a question that ties into that a little bit from Nikki Coddington in the notes that says, that's about biophysical characteristics. How much of a problem are legacy toxins such as lead in soil? And that is potentially an issue, particularly in urban areas and of course in roadways. And I would guess that the concentration of lead in soil has decreased since the 1970s, but it still can remain a problem. And one way to get around this with gardening is to utilize raised beds and to, you know, bring in clean soil and compost. And that's been a way to get around it. And, you know, the students, to get back to what Commissioner Drummond was just saying, the students mentioned, you know, emphasized, I think, that ground truth seeking to visit these sites and look at the traffic patterns and accessibility and things like that, in part in order to assess liability or potential liability. There were some other hands raised. Anne, you're on mute. You need to unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you so much. This is a very profound discussion, the opening of a very profound discussion in our county. And I thank you all, the Capstone Project people, you are amazing. This is a hugely important thing, and you've done an excellent job of laying out all the issues and providing the basis of information. I thank the county for supporting you. And my question is a little bit, it's begun to be addressed just in the recent conversations by Libby and Peter. And my question was, I was so glad to notice that you reported the importance of identifying need and support in the area of the residual property, because as Peter alluded to, the reason why a school garden fails, a personal household garden fails, or any community garden or municipal garden fails is because there isn't the commitment to it. And so identifying the commitment to it is the critical step. So now that you've identified which residual properties, you know, are optimal for potential community gardens, how exactly do you recommend the county goes about, or communities go about identifying where there's community support, interest, and commitment for creating and maintaining and enjoying and benefiting from a community garden? And Libby started that. Libby, you started to answer that question quite well.
I will say what we did in Eastchester, and I think what I've heard from other people is you have a small buy-in, just a small cost, and then people are committed to it. And just having that little stake in the game gets them more further committed. We also have a bit of a waiting list, so you know we could probably charge more money, but we charge enough that covers the augmentation of the soil with compost and outside. There's construction, there's things that go with it. So, but anyway, just having a little stake in the game, makes people more committed to it.
There was a school garden in Mount Kisco that turned out to be very successful. The principal was very committed, and she knew that her school community had a lot of immigrants who had agricultural backgrounds. And so she identified that fact, and with a lot of commitment on her part, got a grant to start very, very small, very little money she had. But the commitment was huge. And the thing took off and involved the children and their parents and the teachers, and it really lifted off. I'm not sure where it is now. Honestly, I lost track of it. But the thing is, you can start with just a few people even, but you need a really hot coal. It's got to be a very hot coal, and then it catches, especially if there is a need within the community. But you've identified the residual properties that have, you know, potential, which is also important, because you can't do a community garden on a completely inappropriate lot for all the reasons that you identified. So that process that Libby started to outline of putting up a sign, maybe like, what would you like to see here? Our chance to make this into something, surveys, you know, I don't know. Do you think further student projects might begin to actually do this on the priority residual properties that have been identified?
Yeah. Thank you.
And so, oh, if I could just speak to that, I think that engaging students is one of the best ways to sort of set up this framework, because everybody loves kids and everybody wants to teach kids about establishing and rooting food sovereignty, right? And so I think that, you know, neighbors receiving a door-to-door survey from local school kids would be a lot more amenable to considering and just like different way than they ever had before. So it could be a really refreshing way to set something up.
Yeah, and if I could add something, something that we heard from numerous experts that we interviewed was the importance, the really, really large importance of having a champion at the community level that knows the community where the garden is, you know, going to be set up. Someone who has, who's admired and respected and well known, and who will be there for the long run. And this is the case in any sustainable development issue, especially in, you know, when we go think about water policy and how that came about. It's kind of the same route. You need a good champion to carry it on the long road, and also for every kind of having the set up beforehand, who will be running the garden and who's kind of going to be invested on the long term, and then getting that really good volunteer base of individuals who have the time and the passion, as some of you mentioned, for gardening is really, really crucial.
Yeah, you know, I say a lot of times elections have consequences. I say it almost every time I have an opportunity to speak, and we're very fortunate. We have County Executive Latimer. We also have amazing county legislators, and one of them here, Nancy Barr, would like to speak, and she has a question. So I think we'd like to hear from her. Thank you, Nancy.
Yes. Sure. Well, first of all, wonderful job, you guys. Really, really impressive. I have a daughter who's same year as you, graduating this year. And, you know, she just did her honors project on a biology subject. So, you know, I've been watching a lot of these lately, and I'm just so amazed by, you know, the young people in our community. So wonderful job. Thank you very much. The other thing I wanted to underscore what you just said about having somebody who is sort of the key person for any given garden, because you really need somebody who people can go to if they have a question, somebody who can say, hey, you know, we need money for this, or we need somebody to take care of the gardens, you know, over the summer in the case of the school gardens, because we have a really nice community garden at the Portchester Middle School. And usually the students do take care of it, and the food does go home with students who are, you know, in need. But over the summer, when there's no school, they don't always have what they need in the way of people to take care of the garden. So an organization that I'm involved with that's called the Council of Community Services has donated money a couple of times towards hiring an intern. So it's still a young person, but somebody who can be there over the summer. But somebody has to come around and ask us for the money, and somebody has to, you know, explain to the intern what has to be done and so forth. So I think, you know, you're exactly right. There needs to be somebody who is sort of the point person. In this case, there's a teacher there who's very, you know, super enthusiastic about this, and it's been very successful. We also have one in outside a housing project in Portchester. And just as you said, Elia, there was a member of the community who was very well respected, and he really cared about this kind of thing, and so they got it going over there. And so I think that, you know, it almost, you know, I don't know exactly which is the starting point. I think you've sort of identified a couple of things. You know, do you start with finding that person? Do you start with just seeing if there is interest in the community? But maybe if you don't know the community, maybe you really have to start with organizations like, I don't know, Boys and Girls Clubs, or, you know, so I think there's a lot of different.
The local Citizen Action Committee, their Green Policy Committee, and also garden clubs or their Beautification Foundation. Those are too big. Those are going to continue. And maybe even people within those die out, but there's somebody else that takes over that. I didn't mean die, but I meant, you know, peters out and that somebody else can take over. So those are like not just individuals, but an organization that oversees you know.
Right. Because I do agree that students can be, you know, the best, you know, they can be the people who are on the ground and really, you know, driving it, but students come and go. And so there really needs to be somebody who is going to be there next year when, you know, one group of students moves on to their next thing. But I think it's terrific. And you've really started a discussion. And frankly, even if those particular properties that, you know, were the subject of this study don't work out for one reason or another, the work that you've done to identify land anywhere in the county and, you know, to help people who want to start these community gardens is going to be, you know, invaluable. And I hope we can help to keep it, you know, going and can serve as a clearinghouse for this kind of information that you've gotten started with.
Yeah, just before we, I know David Jaros, who was one of the founders of the Pleasantville Garden, wanted to provide a comment on this as well, but I also wanted to highlight something that you said, Nancy, about, you know, paying their intern. And so we actually found that, you know, if you pay the champion or the master gardener, that can actually help a lot as well, because it's very hard to manage a community garden as well as hold a full-time job and try to make ends meet. So that's why funding is also so important. So I'm just going to hand it over to David, and then I think we need to move on. We have quite a few raised hands.
Sure, thank you, Sonia. And Nancy, just to tag on to a little bit of what you spoke about, what we learned from starting our garden, and again, it was my son's idea, 11-year-old kid. So my wife and I really ended up being the champions with him for getting this done. As we progressed into the project, got it up and running, we started to add supporters onto the work that we were doing to help us think through options and ideas and things like that. And what that eventually led to was starting a board of directors for the garden itself. And we launched it in 2014, and my son went to college last year, so he's really had to remove himself from the organization. And my wife and I now are working our way out of the organization as well and letting the organization fly on its own. So being able to create, moving from a champion to a group of champions, and being able to create that passion and the desire and the need has worked for us. It threw a lot of work to get there, but we've seen the importance of that, building those layers of support, and other people who can take on the responsibility and the role over time. So it's not only identifying the champion, but as Peter just said, identifying the succession of champions and how you're going to continue that year after year. Our hope with this project was that it wouldn't leave or die when we were needing to walk away from it. And you know, through a lot of work from us and others, we've been able to create this quote unquote succession plan now. So it's really just backing up what both of you said. Thank you.
Yeah, and just before we move on to Ellen for her question, I just wanted to read out some of the things that are being said in the chat, because those won't be available to the people who view this recording. So some people have pointed out that Hilltop Hanover Farm and the Cornell Cooperative Extension and their Master Gardeners program can be really good resources. And Pralaya also wanted to add to her comment that keeping the community in the driver's seat, especially in regions with lower socioeconomic status, is very important, and that is what ensures greater success in long-term garden establishment. And then Libby also highlighted Hilltop Hanover and the Cornell Cooperative Extension as essential organizations, as well as WestPAC, Intergenerate, the Bionutrient, and the Bionutrient Food Association. So with that, let's go over to Ellen.
Hi, thanks so much. This has been such a wonderful presentation. So many great contributions, and highlights things that really shed light on resources here in the county and the true potential, which I think we're still uncovering. I did have a few questions that I had posted in the chat space, so I'll just mention them here. One is if any of these resources, particularly the Planting Westchester Guide and some of the fact sheets, if you think that they can be made available in Spanish, that would really be very helpful. And if anyone has thoughts on that, or that's just something down the road that perhaps, you know, can be considered as all of this material solidifies further. And also the other two questions I had, if any of the resources includes best practices in these gardens. You know, want to ensure that growing food that we're using some of the most current concepts and the most important concepts that are also protecting the health of the people who are doing the gardening, and the communities and the watersheds and properties where they are. So things along the lines of just steps that are consistent with pesticide-free practices. You know, there are great resources available, but if that was considered. And finally, matching up homeowners. I think that while Southern Westchester is, I think homeowners have smaller properties, I think that there are likely properties in Northern Westchester where perhaps homeowners have a good chunk of property that they may be willing to, in some way, donate, and I put donate in quotes, to potential gardeners. And, you know, maybe that's also an option. Certainly there's, you know, a vast area of Northern Westchester that is more rural and looks different than Southern Westchester. But it wouldn't surprise me that people in Southern Westchester who may have even a little corner of their yard that might be a smaller community garden, you know, maybe a neighborhood, you know, with a few people tending it. So just throwing out these questions if anyone can answer them. And thank you so much again. This is really great. And congratulations to all of you, and many thanks to everyone involved.
Yeah, thank you for coming and for raising those excellent points of discussion. Just to read out some of the things that have been mentioned in the chat, we were originally looking at making these things available in Spanish. That didn't end up happening because of the constrained timeline, and then also the disruption in the middle of the semester. But Libby has offered her services. She speaks Spanish and would love to help out over the summer. And our professor, Dr. Joyce Klein Rosenthal, has suggested that could be a great part-time job for a current student or anybody who's bilingual to assist with translation. And then I want to turn it over to Pralaya to answer some questions regarding the best practices.
Yeah, and I think Fiona can probably speak a little bit about in terms of the fact sheets that we that she created, or a couple of us worked on. But in terms of a resource that can help with best practices, we have a couple interviews that we've recorded that are wonderful. One with Gerard Lordell from Grow NYC. He goes into extreme detail in terms of what, kind of at the level of the residential stakeholder, and also at the community garden level, if you're are creating one, in terms of like what practices are important for different reasons. If you want to preserve local biodiversity or foster greater biodiversity, if you want to, if your goal is to increase food outputs, if your goal is to, especially mitigation of climate change was a large topic that we discussed. So that will be a resource that I believe we'll be handing over to the county, and they'll put it on the website. And I think it will be a great tool for community if the clip is kind of split up in little sections based on what the topic is. You can click on it at the community level and potentially, watch that to create a strategy for your garden. And then in terms of the fact sheets, I don't know if Fiona, if you want to, that will have a lot of information.
Yeah, thanks, Pralaya. I can speak briefly to two of those questions. And thank you so much for the question about the Spanish resources. I don't want to be redundant, but I just want to echo what everyone else has been saying, that there's a really huge need for Spanish language resources. And we were able to find some resources on container gardening that are in Spanish. But as Libby mentioned, that's a project that we can potentially take over the summer to try to translate the resource list, because there's a really big need for that. And then in terms of the best practices, we were careful to include resources we were careful to include resources in the resource lists that went into best practices, and especially talked about how to take care of plants without using really heavy pesticides, how to make sure that the soil quality is really high, make sure that there's no contaminants. So I think that there's some information that we have about best practices in terms of taking care of the people that are doing community garden work, and then also the surrounding biosphere. And there's always more information to be gathered and resources to be found, and kind of more work to build out that resource. I hope that answers a little bit of both of those questions.
Libby, I see you have your hand raised. Did you want to add something to this discussion, or is there anybody else who'd like to add anything?
Thanks, Sonia. I just wanted to follow up on the bilingual translation. Thanks, Ellen, for that critical point. I want to add that in our investigation of the residual properties, and just even looking at the Census Bureau's narrative profiles, we saw that upwards of 40% of residents in those tracts were speaking a language other than English at home, and that language was predominantly Spanish. So when we're thinking about how to drum up support for these parcels and designing neighborhood surveys, we definitely should think about, as a default, producing them in both English and Spanish, at least. Thanks, sorry.
Yes, great. And then if this discussion, I think, is mostly concluded, I want to move on to Carol. Thank you for waiting so patiently.
Okay. Can you hear me now? I think I'm not muted.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So first of all, I wanted to thank you. It was such a wonderful presentation. I'm really impressed by the work that you've done. We have a small community, really small community garden in Tarrytown that the Environmental Council has been responsible for over 20 years. So that goes to what Peter was saying about getting a group. I don't know whether that's the best way, but at least it's maintained it. We only have 30, we had to use raised beds because of the soil quality. And we also, one of the practices is it has to be organic, so no pesticides. Most of the gardeners are immigrants. Most of them are Ecuadorian. So we do have some information in Spanish if you want that. But I think what I got out of this whole presentation, in addition to what FCWC is trying to do long-term with community gardens over in EJ communities, what I got is that there's such a broad way of looking at community gardens, and we have only looked at it in a very narrow way. So I think this is going to be very helpful for us. So thank you.
Yeah, of course. I just wanted to add something from Navigator, who wanted to add transportation is an issue for lower income communities, and getting to plots in northern Westchester that might be available could be difficult in that case. Are there any responses or to what Carol said, or shall we move on to Janet?
Go ahead, Janet. Or Jen, sorry.
Hi.
Go away.
I just wanted to say I loved your presentation. It never hurts to have really good information to be able to make decisions and prioritize choices for communities. And I also wanted to echo the fact that we have to remember this is the Northeast, and community gardens are not all year round. And however, greenhouses can be. You start them early, you heat them, you can use different sources of power for them. We don't have to use diesel. We could find alternative energy sources for some grease out. We can think out of the box to provide community resources and community ways for communities to gather and plan local food sourcing. You know, I do work with Hilltop Hanover Farm, and you know, you won't be surprised to know the very first day that our online store opened, all the produce sold out in 1 hour, where last year we had a lot of produce left over. There's an unprecedented need, an unprecedented amount of people without food resources that are fresh fruits and vegetables. In the food pantries, the majority of the food is non-perishable. So this community need is going to grow rather than shrink. And I just love that you guys have given us a ground floor to like think out of the box, and thank you so much. But I do want us to like, I love the comment community is the bigger word in community garden. And so anyway, I like the idea of greenhouses. Like, why couldn't we find ways to, anyway, whatever. I don't know what I'm saying. I'm just enjoying the brainstorming. And
we're trying to bring community gardens to the lower half of the county, and there's not a lot of funds for greenhouses and that sort. And,
well, the upper part of the county is watershed. So, you know, we have to have larger tracts of land in a lot of areas to keep the water clean.
Well, and actually, Janet's point is interesting because cold frames are cheap. You know, you can use recycled, you know, reused materials to create a cold frame. And you know what? When you have the community garden commitment, people that are motivated, they're going to figure that out, especially if, as Janet said, you create some materials that say, hey, don't think just like 4 months for your garden. Maybe you can have a way of growing something in December, January, and February, because people will think of it. It's that motivating for humans to think about food once they get really onto it. So thank you, Janet. That was actually a really good insight. I
grew up in California, so I'm totally baffled by this dead zone happens in the midwinter. I'm like, where's the freaking arugula? There isn't any.
Yeah, I'm out in California right now, so I can definitely relate to
that. Thank you.
Yeah, and just to read out what Pralaya messaged, so she just wanted to emphasize that goes along with what Radley Horton mentioned to us. So we need to make sure that we plan for the climate of the future rather than the past.
Right.
And greenhouses are a great idea en route, especially as the climate changes and continues to change.
And one other quick point to add on to that is that to popularize the notion of, can the 1 million people in Westchester County think about eating food that's grown within, well, let's start with 100-mile radius and then shrink it to 50-mile radius, and really try and make that we're part of this Hudson Valley region. This is where we're rooted. This is the watershed we live in. What is the carrying capacity of the land? Can we start to think that our bioregion can sustain and nourish the people and the creatures who live here, and just get people really thinking about local self-sufficiency and bioregional independence kind of thing.
Yeah, thank you. And then Jan, did you want to make a comment or ask a question?
Yes, I just wanted to say that, yes, sometimes you can get grant money for the greenhouses, for the hoop houses.
Jan, we're having some trouble hearing you.
Turn your sound up.
Yeah. You know what, I have my headset. Can you hear me? No.
A little bit, not very much. If you want, you can also type in your comment.
You could also just speak closer to the microphone of your, whatever you're using. Just put your head a little closer.
Now you can hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Is that better? Okay.
Bingo.
Sorry about that. I took it off and I should have kept it on. But I was about to say that you can get, there are sometimes there's grant money for greenhouses from USDA and NRCS. And I think greenhouses are a great idea. I also have always been an advocate for having community gardens or gardens on the colleges, like Westchester Community College. I know there are a lot of students there that really would like to learn about gardening and growing their own food. We've had discussions with some of the students about having a program, because I'm on the Native Plant Center steering committee, and we've talked about having a garden where the students could grow vegetables and they could actually harvest the vegetables and possibly take some of them home or eat them while they're, in class, take a break. So I think the community colleges, the colleges in Westchester, it would be great to consider growing vegetables at those locations. It would be really helpful, I think. And Peter, you were at the meeting yesterday. We talked about, speaking of local farms and local food, we have a farm called Hemlock Hill. And I understand there was a wait list to get in. They had to take numbers because it was so busy, oversold. So local food.
You have to reserve your spot in line.
Yeah, you had to take a number and reserve your spot because local food is in such demand, and the farm can't even keep enough food. They can't produce enough for the people that are going there. So it's incredible. And so the places that we can use to grow food and educate people how to grow and it's so important. And I think that helps a lot with climate change and everything that's going on in the world. I think it would really be helpful.
Yeah. To your point about community colleges and using college campuses as places to grow food, I just want to read out this comment from Mary, who works at Westchester Community College, and thank you, Ellen, for resending that in the chat. She had commented earlier. She works at the community college in Valhalla, and she works with the Student Environmental Club, and they have a community garden on campus. So just wanted to share that from her, and that this work is already being done.
I think they could probably do even a little bit more. I know they have a small amount of area there, but it's great. It's great that it's happening, and it should happen at the other colleges if possible.
Yeah, I think Pace should have something. I don't know that they might.
I'm not sure, but they should. Yes.
I wonder if some of these dots could be connected. And one of the things that the students found is that there isn't enough land for community gardens but one asset of Westchester County is, especially in the northern portion of the county, is that people have lawns, yards, and whether there could be some kind of, I mean, maybe even a grant to teach, home gardening, and then that, to connect to some of the donation sites that are constantly running.
Taking care of my skin was my first step.
So, to connect home gardens with those food banks and that are constantly running low on fresh food, whether that could be something that's cultivated, no pun intended.
And just to read out some of the comments that have been put in the chat, Gwyneth Jones says that Pace does have a small student garden at the Pleasantville location. And then Nikki Connington wanted to clarify the comment about property owners allowing their land to be used for community gardens. So if there is any obstacle about liability, maybe we can figure out a way to resolve it if necessary with legislation. So maybe that way the Good Samaritan law limits liability for food donation. And then Ellen wanted to add, if you're interested in community gardens or community colleges or colleges as sites for community gardens, reach out to Angelo Spillo, who heads the department at Pace in Pleasantville.
Andrew Spilios. I know him really well. He lives right around the corner from my house. He's a good friend of mine. Spilios.
Sorry for the mispronunciation.
No problem.
Great. So I think Fiona wanted to add something.
Yeah, thanks, Sonia. I just wanted to add that one of the expert interviews that we did was with a group of people at the Stepping Stones Children's Museum in Norwalk, Connecticut, and we learned about them through David Juros. And they are doing some really cool work to partner with the school district in Norwalk to connect kids with community gardening and with food access. So I just wanted to highlight that because this conversation about finding champions, finding really engaged communities to work with community gardens. The Norwalk example is a really cool iteration of that. And it's a really interesting example of both the school district being a champion. So I'm not sure how school districts in Westchester County work or if there's an option for that, but it seems like that would be a really interesting way to connect kids and to have a very consistent participation in community gardens. So I just wanted to highlight that.
Are garden co-ops a thing where people participate and taking care of the garden and cultivating the garden, and then they get to take home food in return? Did you run across any models like that?
I can take that question. Or go ahead.
No, go ahead, Fiona.
Oh,
sorry, I can't find my hand button on my Zoom, so I have to do this analog and just raise my hand. But in terms of schools, there's like 42 school districts in Westchester County, but there are 2 BOCES, and they do technical assistance and training, and I could see them as being a great point to work with school districts on how to roll something like that out. And they can assess the interest among all the different school districts, and then they'll get stakeholders at every level of a school district to come in, and then they'll do a training. So that might be a good opportunity.
Great, thank you. And then Janet Harkham also added in the chat that Katona Lewisboro, I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, I'm sorry, and many others have school gardens all at their schools. And then Millie McGraw asks, did you run across community gardens at houses of worship? And yes, we did actually. The Pleasantville Community Garden is located right next to a church there. So churches are actually really great resources for community garden sites, especially if you don't own the land. They're often willing to donate that land for free or for a reduced price, and can be really great spots for locating these gardens if you don't want to buy the land. And then before we get to Libby, I'm sorry, thank you for being patient. Peter just added in the chat that our Ann Hutchinson Elementary School has a massive all-organic community garden nurtured by Zero Waste Cafeteria and curated by Dave O'Neill. So thank you for that. And then I'll just hand it over to Libby for her comment.
Sonia, with respect to gardens at churches, I wonder if maybe Nada could, if she's still on here, speak to her work and Westpac Foundation's work at Bethel Baptist Church and their gardening efforts, as well as with the First Seventh-day Adventist Church of White Plains, because I believe that she's done food justice work at those institutions, as well as to circle back to gardens on college campuses. Anjali, I remember that you initially suggested we look at a rather large parcel of land, which is actually on the Westchester Correctional Facility campus, sort of in central Westchester, but that we were brainstorming a collaboration between the New York Medical College and the Westchester Community College, and it's right near the Stone Barns Agriculture Center, so there seem to be a lot of institutional resources that could be crowdsourced and so, sorry, that's a lot.
Yeah, we're trying to follow up on that as part of our next step efforts.
Yeah, we are bringing there's going to be a compost education facility there. And we're just building that out. That's going to be composting education for municipalities, institutions, and schools that want to set up a, smaller than just a backyard composting facility, but, a larger facility for like a municipality or something like that. And that's going to be there. And we saw an opportunity to, expand to a community garden of sorts. So we're looking into it. And thanks, Anjali, bringing that up.
I believe David Juros wants to add something.
Thank you, Sonia. I just wanted to mention I've had the fortune of being able to travel around a lot for my job. I work at Wholesome Wave. We do nutrition incentive programs across the U.S. And being that I'm this community gardener, I've had an opportunity to see gardens across the country and in really some pretty amazing places. And it really comes down to the fact that it's about desire and need and those champions in different places. I've seen community gardens where they've replaced flower gardens in front of hospitals in Arizona and New Mexico. I've seen in the Navajo Nation, I was able to take a tour through the Navajo Nation. We do some work there. There is a trading post, which is, where people basically get all of their food. The owner, because of supply chain issues, created a garden behind the trading post, and he grows behind and then sells it very inexpensively within the store. That's really not a community garden, but adding that locally grown food to what he's able to sell to his customers is a big part of his business. So, where there's a will, there's a way, and there's little plots of land, hospitals, like small community hospitals that have plots outside of the front entrance that are maintained by nurses and doctors and people from the community. So it really is about having the will, the passion, and then the champions to get it done. Again, with the need, of course, too. So just wanted to add that in.
Thank you so much for that comment. And then it is 4 o'clock, so we did want to bring this meeting to an end and keep us on schedule. I know you all probably have other commitments. I wanted to turn it over briefly to Dr. Joyce Klein Rosenthal to add a few comments. But after that, I can't speak to everybody's availability, but I can stick around for a little bit, a few more minutes to answer some questions if there are any lingering questions. I know this discussion could go on for hours, and I invite anybody who might have a couple of questions to stay on after for just 5 minutes or so to finish that up. but I'll hand it over to Joyce for now.
Thank you. Great. This was fascinating to meet everybody and to, hear the real scoop on Westchester community gardening. So thank you to everybody who joined today. I really want to commend the teaching assistant too. I forgot to mention that at the beginning. Maria Claudia, I think you're here all the way from Peru for her expertise and her contributions to supporting the work that the students did. You guys are amazing. The student team, all 5 of you, I'm so grateful that you were able to learn as you go. I think incorporating things like the climate change impacts, to listen to what you were, hearing in interviews really made this project a great success. And Westchester community, we're looking forward to the follow-up. I would love to ask you a question, but maybe I'll hold it given that it's 4:02 p.m. I just want to, Sonia, you've been a terrific project manager and really, really great to work with every single one of you. So thank you. Sonia, maybe I'll pass it back to Peter and Anjali to, close the event. Thank you.
Go ahead, Anjali.
Well, I just, of course, like to thank this group. I think you can see that the past few months have resulted in a number of products, if you will, that will be useful for Westchester County to begin to expand their community garden in order to address food insecurity and general community resilience, including an interactive map to map locations of existing and future community gardens, the how-to manual, and other supporting materials. So we're already exploring, as I said, next steps to build on this work, and really thanks to the students and Professor Rosenthal.
Again, I've said thanks a million times. I can't thank you enough, guys. I am going to make a statement though here, and mark my words. I promise that Millie and I and the rest of Westchester County is going to absorb this. We're going to take this up, and it's going to have a legacy, guys. I make that promise to you. This is so important. You've done such a fantastic job. There's no way that we cannot incorporate this into, our current, thoughts and plans, and have it be a part, another great asset that we can give to our municipalities and our constituents. I make that promise to you that this is going to live on, and so thank you again, and Godspeed to you all. It's an exciting time. I don't know if you guys know, but Anjali and I are both Columbia graduates, so to see the young students are so far over our head these days, what you guys are doing, and especially in these difficult times, it's just amazing, and we can't thank you enough all. Really appreciate this. And again, I make the promise this is going to carry on, and we're going to utilize this and implement this into our community gardens and whatever we can do here in the county.
Oh yeah, I just want to reiterate what Peter said. Peter, Nikki Coddington, and I, and Anjali, we really, really look forward to continuing all of the great work that you guys have done and building upon it. It's really so exciting, and check back in with us in a few months and see what we've accomplished and how we've built upon this. So thank you guys so much. And like Peter and Anjali, I too am a Columbia graduate, so this is nice for that as well. And just congratulations to all of you who are graduating. It's kind of a surreal way to graduate. And you guys are all spread out and everything too across the country and maybe the world, but really appreciate you continuing to put forth all of this effort and strong work to complete this project and to help us out here in the county. So thank you.